Once again, good morning, beloveds. Let me begin this morning with a confession. When I first began to envision my talk for this morning, I was anticipating, once again, a standalone sermon focusing on the 250th anniversary or the semiquincentennial, listen to that again, the semiquincentennial of America's independence from Great Britain. However, if you listen carefully to the words of the Level 42 song from this morning's meditation, you know that things did not exactly work out as I originally planned. Exactly. Just as was the case with my last talk during the Memorial Day weekend, the sermon suddenly and beautifully evolved into part 6 of Gina's amazing series, this time focusing on the sacred symbol of the One. And while there are no travelers, goosebumps, or icebergs in this story, there are some pretty compelling historical characters and lenses to consider. But before we meet them, let me start at the beginning. Several days ago, a very dear friend posted this plaintive message on her social media page. Quote, "This has been one of the hardest seasons of my life. I keep telling myself after the phoenix bursts into flames, it is reborn. I keep waiting for the rebirth part because the flames part really sucks." Unquote. And especially given that reaction, I think that many of us can relate to these sentiments, both as individuals and collectively. As we recognize the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, we have so very much to celebrate regarding the unfolding of the infinitely bold American experiment, while at the same time, we also experience a growing sense of unease and uncertainty over a wide variety of ongoing political, economic, social, cultural, and technological challenges, causing some to wonder what the U.S. as a whole can do as an encore in its next 250 years to further evolve into the more perfect union that the framers of the U.S. Constitution aspired to when creating that profound document during a very hot, humid summer in 1787. Now, I respond to my friend's post in this way, quote, "Rebirth is inevitable, beloved. You will rise and transcend anew. In the meantime, keep doing what I know that you do. Continue to find joy and hope in the simple things from day to day. In these times especially, such joy demonstrates resistance and promotes healing and resilience." Unquote. And while I didn't say this to her in the moment, I realized that our ability to find joy, healing, and resilience in the ordinary activities of life is a significant part of the legacy of freedom bequeathed to us by the founders of this nation. Now, I later learned that my message to my friend is an example of practicing Respair. Now, that is a rare and obsolete English word, and by the way, so rare and obsolete apparently that spell check miscorrected it in the program today. Notice the title of the sermon, Freedom, Repair, and Interdependence. Well, repair would be a totally different sermon, so forget that. But I am talking about Respair, a rare and obsolete English word dating back to the year 1500 that means fresh hope, a recovery from despair. It serves as the exact positive opposite to despair, representing the return of optimism and resilience after a period of hardship or difficulty. And looking back through the annals of U.S. history, it is obvious that many a July 4th over time has been recognized by a mix of fireworks, barbecues, celebration and chest thumping, uncertainty, and yes, sometimes even despair. And looking back at a couple of historic July 4ths over time, it is also obvious that New Thought thinkers and ministers have discovered a healing balm of Respair that harkens back to some of the founding values of this nation: natural rights and the inherent freedoms that spring from them. Now, I have two specific July 4th sermons or messages in mind. The first is from Ernest Holmes himself in a talk that he gave at the Wiltern Theater in Los Angeles on July 4th, 1937, that amplifies the excerpt from The Science of Mind that we heard in our second inspirational reading. Holmes said this: "We desire freedom. We do not like evil. We do not like pain. We do not like poverty. We do not like unhappiness. Why should we? None of us likes to go to bed and worry all night and get up tired out in the morning. God does not impose it upon us. Why do we do it? Because we sense freedom, we sense liberty, we sense God, yet out here in the objective world we experience limitation. And the argument is between what we feel ought to take place and what we see and the world experiences. It seems as though we are two people, one that experiences evil and one that knows that there should be no evil. The evolution of freedom in the human mind is a slow process. Many movements in the world that claim to be seeking liberty only produce new kinds of bondage. We should be beware of them. They are born out of the idea of depression. They are born out of the spirit of bondage. If we want freedom, we must understand that freedom can never come by the imposition of a will of the minority over the majority. It is born finally and only in such degree as some system is devised whereby individuals are allowed to complete freedom so long as they do not, in their freedom, impose bondage on someone else. And I should mention right here that that definition of freedom that Holmes just gave us is the exact one that I've been using in my Introduction to American Politics courses over the past 30-plus years. But to continue with Holmes' July 4th message, quote, "I believe that the true spirit of democracy is a spiritual conception where there is freedom, liberty without license, and a flexibility that makes evolution possible on the foundation of freedom. As we enter into the spirit of the meaning of Independence Day, the day when liberty symbolically was conceived, the day when freedom objectively in our country was announced, we should think of it not merely as a political system or form of government, but we should think of it as a spiritual conception, an idea in divine mind itself, taking form in human experience. We should learn to love that liberty, and in loving the idea, we should learn tenderly and prayerfully handle the embodiment of that idea and nourish it always to greater strength. We should really conceive again the great spiritual conception of that rugged man of God who said, quote, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And that final sentence, of course, was the words of the great emancipator himself, Abraham Lincoln. Now, let that all sink in for a moment. Think about the circumstances and sentiment behind Ernest Holmes' prophetic words Because in 1937, when he gave that talk, the United States was still taking its initial steps towards its eventual recovery from the Great Depression. That is the biggest single economic meltdown in U.S. history. In fact, one significant step in that process of recovery, the Social Security Administration actually began operations in January of that year, 1937. Full recovery, though, was still a decade away and took a global two-front war to complete. Now, history tells us of the pervasive sense of despair that gripped the nation during these years. In fact, many people were unsure if the U.S. would actually survive this economic cataclysm. So doesn't it make sense that on July 4th, 1937, at the Wiltern Theater, Ernest Holmes offered to all those in attendance a chance to experience Respair, to feel that the United States, not just as a political system, but as a nation and as an idea, could begin to rebuild and heal into a more resilient people, all through the power of freedom, unity, oneness, and divine mind. Though not exactly the type of freedom that we tend to hear in a typical recounting of America's founding story. But more on that in a bit. Let's fast forward now to a much more recent time of uncertainty and despair in the United States. The year is 1979, and legendary New Thought minister Eric Butterworth delivers what is considered by some to be the most epic New Thought sermon of all time, entitled The Greatest Freedom, delivered on July 1st of 1979. Now, in researching all of this, I was lucky enough to discover a PDF of Butterworth's original sermon script, including his handwritten notations, which was very cool. And after reading and reflecting on it, I have to agree that it is pretty darn epic and all about Respair. Listen to this excerpt. On this coming July 4th, known as Independence Day, there will be a lot of talk about freedom. And again, against the backdrop of long gas lines, strikes, shortages, and the harassment of inflationary pressure, there may well be a desire to redefine the word freedom. Certainly everyone hungers for freedom from lack, from illness, from fear, from bondage, to any and all circumstances over which we have no control. In America, we have not only entertained the idea of freedom as doing what we want, but also of having what we want. This is why gasoline shortages are so annoying. All we can think of is if we have enough money to buy, there should always be the freedom to have. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth shall make you free." We miss the real meaning if we think of freedom as from gas lines, freedom from shortages, freedom from pain, etc. For there are no shortages, no limitations in God or in truth. These things are in human experience. Truth makes you free in mind, free from worry, from discouragement, and free to choose the level of consciousness in which you meet life and change in circumstances. And he wraps this portion up by saying, unfortunately, and this is key, unfortunately, we have thought of freedom as an escape rather than as a creative act. The emphasis has been on freedom from something rather than freedom to do or to be something. The emphasis has been on dropping out or running away. But the greatest freedom is the freedom to grow into the strong person we are created to be, facing up to successfully coping with these things that we otherwise try to escape from. if we try to escape, to run away, to lean on people or on society's institutions, we are not achieving freedom. Freedom is not an escape. It is the choice to be strong, to understand, to find the transcendent way. Now, in addition to all the challenges that face the U.S. that Reverend Butterworth mentioned at the outset of his message, America was also facing a profound sense of despair and identity crisis brought about by the ongoing Iranian hostage situation. Though the era and phrasing vary, both Ernest Holmes and Eric Butterworth are evoking an impactful and healing sense of Respair by invoking the transformative power of divine mind and the one that stems from a different type of freedom that was also envisioned by America's founders. The notion of freedom to rather than freedom from. Because you see, traditional discussions of freedom in the context of the American experiment center around the notion that American independence in 1776 provided us with freedom from external tyranny, bondage, and the like. While freedom, when conceptualized in the context of New Thought, as well as in the ideas and aspirations of some of the American founders themselves, emphasizes freedom to release your spiritual capacities and choose positive mental attitudes regardless of your external situation. This represents genuine interdependence, not independence, but interdependence. And when discussing freedom and liberty in the context of the U.S. and the rest of the Western world, we often discuss the concept of natural rights. That is, basic freedoms granted to all human beings by God, which cannot be taken away by anyone else under most circumstances. Civil liberty is commonly understood as being so crucial for human thriving that government should not be able to take them away under most circumstances, are understood as being an outgrowth of Locke's concept of natural rights, as adapted by Jefferson and Madison and Adams in the Declaration of Independence. Now, ironically, civil liberties are commonly understood by political scientists and philosophers as being freedoms granted to each of us as individuals, despite their divine origins, as understood by Locke and everyone else. Thus, American independence, that is, the need to separate from Great Britain to regain natural rights illegitimately taken from the American colonists by the British government, eventually helps to spawn the highly individualistic ethos of the United States that we still experience today. In many people's minds, for example, individually granted civil liberties are seen as being qualitatively superior to group-based civil rights. And at the same time, it can also be argued that the authors of the Declaration of Independence were not just promoting freedom from, but also freedom to. This can be seen by the fact that in borrowing from John Locke's discussion of natural rights, the authors of the Declaration of Independence listed the primary natural rights that they were seeking to regain from independence as being, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote, rather than life, liberty, and property as discussed by Locke himself. While Jefferson, Madison et al. Definitely saw private property rights as an important natural right, they chose instead to emphasize the notion of public happiness in the Declaration of itself. Now, public happiness, which is what they're referring to in the document, refers to a commitment by citizens and government alike to work for the common good of everyone in society. And here's the key bit. Individual happiness and prosperity is seen as an outgrowth of public happiness. Public, collective prosperity comes first and inspires individual prosperity. By centering the notion of public happiness in the document, the authors of the Declaration are not only demonstrating commitment to nurturing the notion of freedom too, but also a strong desire to develop a sense of interdependence amongst the American people rather than mere rugged individualism. Now, unfortunately, this intention of Jefferson, Madison, and Adams has largely been lost in our societal understanding of our historical identity as Americans. Our July 4th celebration should be just as much about freedom to and interdependence as they are about freedom from tyranny and independence. Both Ernest Holmes and Eric Butterworth were definitely on to something. Now, as a political scientist and a New Thought minister, I am profoundly grateful that in our modern parlance, we tend to say that we celebrate the 4th of July much more often than we say Independence Day. In fact, this is consistent with the intentions of American political leaders and ordinary Americans alike during the revolutionary and immediate post-revolutionary periods. Because you see, the Declaration and the Revolution for American political leaders were not a single-minded pursuit of independence. Independence was seen as a means to an end. American political leaders actually tried to bluff King George III with the threat of revolution and independence in the hopes that he would give in and restore their natural rights without the need for bloodshed and separation from Great Britain. But unfortunately, King George called their bluff, and revolution led to independence because that was the only viable alternative for Americans to regain their natural rights, which they prized above all else. And it should also be noted that even after the British withdrew from U.S. territory in 1781, a majority of Americans mourned the loss of their British family ties and their citizenship. Interdependence was still craved, even as independence was taking place. Now, given the myriad challenges that we are facing in the U.S. today, in all aspects of our lives, it is increasingly evident that a different type of revolution is needed, but this time not for independence from an existing tyrannical regime. Instead, we are talking about a revolution of the mind, a revolution in our thinking and practice which recognizes the interdependence of all life, rather than a war of independence from an external tyrant. If widely recognized and practiced, the spiritual conception of freedom, liberty, oneness, and interdependence will also transform our body politic, ending the extreme ideological polarization that paralyzes our government and that the framers of the Constitution feared above anything else. For they designed a system that works only through compromise and consensus. And by the way, the framers understood that the U.S. would always be a work in progress. Note their hope is expressed in the preamble to the Constitution to create a more perfect union. And it's safe to say that we have made significant, though often inconsistent and uneven progress in doing so since 1776. However, Amidst the myriad challenges we face, both as a polity and a society in 2026, I wholeheartedly believe that we should explicitly grow this feeling of Respair that I discussed at the beginning of my message. We can feel a genuine sense of fresh hope as we continue to live in authentic oneness, unity, and interdependence, and spread that mindset to family, chosen family, neighbors, and strangers alike. We can genuinely love our imperfect union and find joy from day to day, just as multiple award-winning author Jesmyn Ward describes in discussing her complicated relationship with the state of Mississippi from her book On Witness and Respair. Ward writes, quote, "I breathe. I remain. I remember that Mississippi is not only its ugliness, its treachery, its willful ignorance. It is also my nephew, hurtling his body down a water slide, rocketing to the bottom, joy running from shoulder to heel. It is my godmother boiling pots and pots of shrimp and pouring them into a children's pool so we can eat the delicious spicy mess at our family gathering on the 4th of July. It is my youngest sister smiling and dancing to Al Green in my godmother's driveway while the night enfolds like a hand and the insects hiss with summer's sibilant kiss. It is riding to a convenience store with my childhood friends with the windows down and the night wind caressing me and my cheekbones. UGK booming from the speakers in answer to the booming Mississippi night. It is sitting on the porch with my 78-year-old grandmother, my children sandwiched between us on the swing, making idle talk and watching hummingbirds zip through the air beyond her screen as she tells us stories, flush with joy." What moments bring you joy when thinking about your own life, as well as American life in general, in the 250 years since the outbreak of the American Revolution? What makes your heart sing? What gives you a sense of Respair? Envision it, live it, and go all in. Because you are beloved. You are enough. You are not alone. We are all one. We are free to revolutionize our interdependent lives together as one. Thank you.